Today we are going to talk all about study guides. Some people love them, some people hate them. I'm going to be breaking down the complaints that I've heard that both students and faculty have about study guides. But I'm also going to explain why I think they're useful and what the best study guides include. Stay to the end of this video, and I'll also walk you through what to do if your teacher never gives you a study guide, but how you can make a DIY one instead. Here we go! So what is a study guide? I see study guides in all kinds of different forms because I've peeked into thousands of classrooms all over the world in my job as an academic coach. And they all are structured differently, but the thing that they all have in common is that they are a collection of the ideas and facts that students will be ultimately tested on. Often they're 1 page or 1 to 3 pages. Sometimes they're just a list of tons of key terms and facts. They're a little overwhelming. Sometimes they're a list of 20 main questions. Sometimes they're a list of learning objectives with some key terms. Sometimes they're actual worksheets or outlines that students are invited to fill out. They look like all kinds of things, but what they always are is a collection of everything that is going to be on the final exam in a way that helps the students kind of see, oh, this is the map. This is the map of what we've done and what I need to know for the test. First things first, let's talk about complaints. Here are the complaints that I've heard teachers have about study guides. I hear this word spoon feeding a lot. I'm afraid we're spoon feeding students if we give them a study guide. They create dependence. The students don't learn because they just wait for the study guide, I hear teachers saying. Many think that giving students a study guide fosters a lack of critical thinking. And I also hear teachers saying, it's a lot of work to put together a study guide, and then students don't use them or don't use them well. I think there is an element of truth in all of these complaints about study guides, but also I don't think that means we throw them out and don't give them to students. I think we just get smart about how we set students up for success through the entire quarter or semester, and then when it's time for final exams. We'll talk more about what that looks like in a little bit. But first, following whiteboards. Let's look at the complaints that students have about study guides. The biggest one, and frankly, this is my complaint as well as an academic coach, is that students get them too late when there's not enough time to actually follow through and use them to study. The other complaint I've heard is that there were things on the test that weren't on the study guide and the student didn't study them because they weren't on the study guide. I've had some students say, I just don't do it. It wasn't graded, so there's no incentive to actually use it. And others, and I've experienced this too, say, God, they're so overwhelming. And this is true. I have seen study guides that had 100 or more key terms on them. It was really mind-boggling how much was on there. And then lastly, some students complain they don't get a study guide at all, and so they don't really know what to study for the test. So here's the problem with both of these lists of complaints. Nobody actually teaches teachers and students a way to think about studying so that we're studying constantly through the entire semester, right? And so students become dependent, it is true, on the study guide because they haven't been able to see how the entire curriculum through the semester has built up to supporting them to actually be successful on the final exam. So teachers, if you are worried that you're spoon feeding students with a study guide, it might actually be that you're not actually organized enough in the structure of your curriculum and in the way you enable students to see how you have structured your curriculum, right? It's one thing just to teach in a specific way, but it's another thing to show students, look, this is how I have organized things. This is why I have organized things, because all the brain theory says we need to have these kinds of things in our learning in order to learn well. So please notice how I have structured it. And then train students how to use the structure that you've created when they're by themselves at home studying. Does that make sense? This is kind of a, when the words come out of my mouth, it seems kind of hazy to me, but it's also a really important point. I believe too many teachers simply teach the content without helping students see the structure of how they're teaching so that students understand how to use that structure better when they are studying themselves. And a good study guide makes visible the structures of how you are teaching and also relates to all of your lectures or all your classroom activities. And so students can see that relationship the entire semester long. So the best study guides include the following things from what I have seen. They always include overarching questions or learning objectives, not too many and not too few. I think a list of maybe 5 to 7 overarching questions is the ideal. That way, if the students are able to answer each of those questions, then they probably have a good handle on what the content is. Now, each of those questions might not be answered quickly. They might be answered with 20 or 30 key terms, or with, paragraphs, 5-paragraph essay, each one of them. So I'm not saying these are simple to answer questions, but they are a list of the major themes that you really want the student to have a handle on. Now, it really is helpful to have key terms related to the questions. A very successful study guide that I saw at one point had just, I think, about 5 questions, and then it had a list of 30 to 40 key terms. I think this was a history class, and it said the student should be able to understand how to use these key terms in these major questions that were up there. I do want to guard teachers from having too many key terms on your study guide. I would say 60 or more. I've seen 100 or more. It's so much. It's so overwhelming. The only way I would recommend that is if you were creating the study guide with students as you went along through the semester, and so the students were watching those key terms build. The other way that's helpful is for students to have an easy way to mark off, oh, I really know this one, oh, I really know that one, so that they're able to then only study the ones that they are clear that they don't know. I think it's also really helpful when building towards a cumulative exam to let students know the question types. One of the tips I give students in my Anti-Boring Approach to Powerful Studying online course is to study in the manner of the test. So if your test is going to be a long essay, you want to study not just with flashcards, but maybe by practicing writing an essay or at least an outline to that essay. So that you're practicing articulating the information in the way the teacher is ultimately going to ask you to be presenting it. It's hard to do if you don't know what the test is going to look like. Alternatively, if it's going to be mostly multiple choice, that's a little harder for students to study, but there are ways, like flashcards are a better way to study for a multiple choice test, or even on software like Quizlet, it's easy to do some mock multiple choice there, but it's always better for students to study in the manner of the final questions. A good study guide also has a list of study resources, especially quizzable ones. Like you might list the unit tests that the students could refer to study those questions as an example. Or you might send them to pages in the textbook that have some really good chapter overviews, or even quizzes about the chapter content. I mentioned this earlier, but I also think the best study guides are ones created with students, in partnership with students, the entire semester long. Google Doc is a wonderful way to do this. But students then are being taught how to see what you're teaching and how to turn what you're teaching into their own study guide, but they're also doing that in partnership with you. So it's a wonderful practice of metacognition and thinking, learning to think about thinking, and learning to think about the structure of thinking and learning. Students, hang tight, because at the very end of this video, I am going to be showing you how you can make your very own DIY study guide in case your teacher never gives you one. And actually, teachers, you'll want to stay to the end too, because this DIY study guide that I'm going to teach students is actually an example of a class assignment that you could be doing regularly at the end of each of your units. First, though, I do want to talk about why are study guides helpful? I'm clearly a believer in them. I clearly don't believe that they are spoon feeding. But why, especially in today's learning climate, in today's day and age, are study guides helpful? There's this word I'm repeating over and over on this whiteboard, and it is the word overload. I believe that brains and bodies these days have much more information coming at us than we ever did before. When I was a student, I was less in need of a study guide. In fact, I don't think teachers in the 80s and 90s had the practice of handing out study guides. But back then, we only ever had the textbook that we were reading. We only ever had lecture as a teaching style. We didn't have all of the worksheets coming across the desk and all of the different click here, go to this website, study this, answer these questions, do this. There's so many more types of information coming at students from all kinds of places. It can be hard to track in the midst of all of this pedagogical creative pedagogical choices that teachers are making these days. It can be hard to track, like, what are the concrete details that I'm supposed to be learning right now? And so a study guide can keep a student focused in the midst of all of this information overload. And so I mentioned here it's generally information overload. It's also teaching style overload. And then it's even paper or assignment overload. As an academic coach, I'm consistently shocked how much paper students are juggling. And in this post-pandemic world that we're in, that's actually often digital assignments instead of paper, but it's still, there's a lot of stuff flying back and forth. When I was a student, I barely had to turn anything in. I had to write all my answers in my notebook, and then class the next day was going over our questions to make sure we had them right or to correct them if they were wrong. That was very boring, but it was very consistent, and so it was always very clear what I needed to know. These days, it's less clear because teachers are getting more and more creative about how they teach. So then a good study guide also helps a student structure their studying. And especially if students have to eventually pass a licensing exam, a study guide can be helpful. I am consulting in a medical school right now, and many of the teachers, because they don't want to spoon feed the students, those are their terms, they don't give study guides. But they are actually teaching, they need to teach to the test, right? Ultimately, after this final exam, the student is going to have to pass a board exam in order to be able to move on and to practice medicine in whatever specific way they're training themselves to practice medicine. And so a study guide can help keep them focused on the most important things that they're going to need to know for that licensing exam. And it's not spoon feeding a student to let them know what they're going to be tested on in that kind of an environment. Okay, DIY study guide coming up as soon as you like and subscribe to my channel. Maybe put a comment down below. Do you have a complaint about study guides that I haven't actually shared with you yet? I would love to hear from you. Also, heads up teachers, I have a very special 7-day email course all about whether you should start your own business as an academic life coach. If you have had that little thought, like, I'd like to make a little extra money, or I would really like to spend more time one-on-one with students, really digging into their learning, you might really enjoy this profession. Head on over to gretchenwegner.com/crash course and get a behind the scenes look at what it takes to start and grow a really lucrative and satisfying business. Okay, students, if your teacher doesn't actually provide you a study guide, you can actually create a pretty good one for yourself, especially if your teacher is a more traditional style teacher that uses PowerPoints, that has a classroom syllabus, that is focused on a textbook. So really what you need to do is turn the following things into actual questions. So open up a Google Doc or a Microsoft Word doc or get out a piece of notebook paper and first look for the class objectives. Did your teacher list any objectives in their syllabus? And if so, then those are a wonderful place to know this is what the teacher is going to test me on. So if the objective says, for example, at the end of this course, the student will be able to analyze, usually there are big verbs like that, analyze the causes of World War I and II, then you know, what was the cause of World War I? That is going to be one of your main questions for your DIY study guide. What was the cause of World War II? Objectives can always be turned into questions. I know they're super boring to read, but if you just slow yourself down, break the objective into parts, usually you can see one, if not three questions embedded inside a well-written objective. Another place you can find a good objective is in your textbooks at the beginning of every chapter. So just take a look at those, and if your teacher has a very textbook focused teaching style with lots of reading and then lecture based on the reading, you can be pretty sure that the objectives at the start of a chapter are the right objectives for you. Next, if your teacher is a PowerPoint slide user in their lectures, PowerPoints have titles to them, and usually those titles can be turned into questions. So you can go back, if you are given the PowerPoint slides, you can go back and turn those titles into questions, and then you also have a nice list of things that you know your teacher will likely want to test you on. Textbook main headings are a great way to turn things into questions. And then certainly if you were a note taker and if you had a habit of noticing what are the big topics in the notes, you could turn those topics into questions as well. Students, I recommend you sit down, spend an hour kind of paging through everything, make your one-page list of questions, and then send it to your teacher saying, hey, I just made myself a study guide. Does this look about right? Is this what you think you'll be testing us on? And if so, I'll use it as my guide for studying. And I bet a teacher would actually be pretty impressed with you that you went ahead and put that kind of effort into getting ready to study. And teachers, you also could have a day towards the end of a unit where you ask students to go back and look at all these things and create some questions, submit them to you, and that can be a wonderful way to get them doing an overview of what you've just taught, and then you can pick the best ones that you think you're going to put on the test, or maybe you've made the test already, so you pick the ones that you know are based on what is in the test, and then that becomes a student study guide. It's a wonderful way to teach students how to think about their own thinking. If you have any questions, students or teachers, about any of this, you're always welcome to come to my monthly office hours. GretchenWegner.com/live lets you know when the next one is and allows you to sign up. And I'll see you there, or I'll see you in the next YouTube video. Bye, y'all.